I spent 47 years perfecting my grandmother's recipes, writing them down with love, sharing them freely with anyone who asked. But when my daughter-in-law started treating me like hired help in my own son's kitchen, serving me leftovers while she dined on my creations, I decided it was time she learned what real generosity looks like. What I left her would change everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Evelyn Marie Thompson, and I've been cooking since I could barely reach the kitchen counter standing on my grandmother's wooden step stool. At 73 years old, I can tell you that food has always been the language of love in my family. Every birthday cake, every holiday feast, every comfort meal during hard times came from these weathered hands that have kneaded 10,000 loaves of bread and stirred countless pots of soup. I live in a charming little town called Roswell, about 30 minutes north of Atlanta, where the summer air hangs thick with the scent of magnolia blossoms and the promise of afternoon thunderstorms. My house sits on Elm Street, a modest two-story colonial with white shutters and a wraparound porch where I've spent countless evenings shelling peas and watching fireflies dance in the twilight. The kitchen, though, that's where the real magic happens. It's the heart of my home, with its butcher block countertops worn smooth from decades of use, open shelves lined with mason jars filled with my secret spice blends, and a vintage Chambers stove that belonged to my mother. Growing up in rural Georgia during the 1950s, I learned to cook from my grandmother, Mabel Ruth, who could turn a handful of simple ingredients into a feast that would make grown men weep with joy. She taught me that cooking wasn't just about following recipes. It was about understanding ingredients, respecting tradition, and most importantly, cooking with love. Every Sunday after church, our family would gather around her dining room table for meals that seemed to stretch on forever, filled with laughter, stories, and the kind of food that made you feel like you belonged somewhere special. When I married my husband Robert in 1968, I brought those traditions with me. Robert was a gentleman who worked as a mechanic at the local Chevrolet dealership, and he never complained about coming home to find flour dusting every surface of our kitchen while I experimented with new variations of old family recipes. He'd kiss my flour-covered cheek and tell me the house smelled like heaven. We were blessed with one child, our son Michael, who grew up thinking every mother could make biscuits that melted in your mouth, and fried chicken that was crispy outside and juicy within. Robert passed away 3 years ago after a brief battle with lung cancer, and losing him felt like losing half of myself. But cooking became my solace, my way of keeping his memory alive. Michael would visit every Sunday, just like we used to do at my grandmother's house, and I'd prepare his favorite meals, watching his face light up the same way it did when he was 7 years old, and I'd surprise him with fresh chocolate chip cookies still warm from the oven. Michael works as a regional sales manager for a construction equipment company, traveling throughout the Southeast. He's a good man, responsible and hardworking like his father, though he never quite inherited my passion for cooking. He can manage scrambled eggs and grilled cheese sandwiches, but anything more complicated tends to result in smoke alarms and takeout containers. I didn't mind, though. It gave me purpose, having someone to cook for, someone who appreciated the love I poured into every dish. 2 years ago, Michael started dating Brenda Morrison, a 34-year-old marketing coordinator he met at a business conference in Savannah. She was beautiful in that polished city girl way with perfectly styled blonde hair that never seemed to have a strand out of place, and designer clothes that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. When Michael first brought her home to meet me, I was determined to welcome her with open arms. I prepared a feast that would have made my grandmother proud. Honey-glazed ham with my secret bourbon marinade, creamy mashed potatoes whipped with cream cheese and fresh chives, green beans slow-cooked with bacon and onions, cornbread made from my great-grandmother's recipe that had been passed down for 4 generations, and for dessert, my famous peach cobbler using peaches from the tree in my backyard. Brenda picked at her food like a bird, commenting that everything was very rich, and asking if I had anything lighter or more contemporary. She spent most of the dinner scrolling through her phone and making small talk about her yoga classes and juice cleanses. I tried to engage her, asking about her work, her interests, her family, but her responses were brief and distant. Still, I reminded myself that some people just needed time to warm up, and I was determined to make her feel like part of our family. Over the following months, as their relationship became more serious, I continued my efforts to bond with Brenda. I invited her to go grocery shopping with me, thinking I could teach her about selecting the best ingredients and maybe share some of my cooking secrets. She declined, saying she preferred to shop at Whole Foods and didn't really have time for traditional cooking methods. When I offered to teach her how to make Michael's favorite dishes, she smiled politely and said she was more of a takeout person, and that Michael would just have to adapt to, quote, healthier eating habits. The warning signs were there, but I chose to overlook them because I could see how happy Michael was. He'd been lonely since his divorce 5 years earlier, and seeing him smile again, watching him light up when he talked about Brenda, made me willing to overlook her lack of interest in family traditions. Love makes us blind sometimes, and I wanted so desperately for my son to find happiness that I convinced myself Brenda's coolness toward me was just shyness or nervousness about joining a new family. When Michael announced their engagement last spring, I was genuinely happy for them. I threw them an engagement party in my backyard, stringing lights between the oak trees and preparing all of Michael's favorite foods. I spent 3 days cooking, determined to show Brenda and her family the warmth and love that defined our gatherings. I made my famous barbecue ribs with a sauce recipe that had been perfected over 3 generations, potato salad with hard-boiled eggs and fresh dill, coleslaw with a tangy dressing that had just the right amount of sweetness, and a variety of desserts, including my grandmother's legendary coconut cake. Brenda's mother, Patricia, was a thin, elegant woman who complimented the food but seemed surprised by the casual nature of the gathering. She kept asking about catering companies and seemed puzzled when I explained that I had prepared everything myself. Brenda's sister Jessica was more openly dismissive, making comments about carb overload and asking if I had any quinoa salads or kale dishes. I felt a familiar sting of inadequacy, but I pushed it aside, reminding myself that different families had different traditions. The wedding took place 6 months later at an upscale venue in Atlanta. It was beautiful, I'll give Brenda credit for that, but it felt cold and impersonal to me. Everything was catered by an expensive company that specialized in, quote, modern Southern fusion cuisine, which seemed to mean taking traditional Southern dishes and making them unrecognizable with fancy presentations and unusual ingredients. The wedding cake was a work of art, towering and elegant, but it tasted like it had been made for appearance rather than flavor. I found myself missing the simple joy of family recipes, made with love. After the wedding, Michael and Brenda moved into a new house in a subdivision about 15 minutes from mine. It was a beautiful modern home with a gourmet kitchen that Brenda was
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
proud to show off, complete with granite countertops, stainless steel appliances, and a massive island that looked like something from a cooking show. The irony wasn't lost on me that she had this incredible kitchen but seemed to view cooking as beneath her. At first, the Sunday dinners continued, but they changed dramatically. Instead of coming to my house where I could prepare Michael's favorite meals, they insisted I come to their place. Brenda would order from expensive restaurants or hire a meal prep service, and I would sit at their dining room table eating food that had no soul, no history, no love. Michael seemed happy enough with the arrangement, praising Brenda's efficiency and talking about how nice it was to have restaurant-quality meals at home. I tried to contribute by bringing dishes from home, but Brenda would accept them with a forced smile and barely touch them herself. I'd watch her push my carefully prepared food around her plate while she ate the catered meals, and I began to feel like an unwelcome guest in my own son's life. When I offered to cook dinner for them, Brenda would decline politely, saying she had already ordered something, or that she didn't want me to go to all that trouble. The real change came gradually, so slowly that I didn't notice it at first. Sunday dinners became every other Sunday, then once a month, then only on holidays. When I did visit, I began to notice that Brenda would set the table with beautiful china and crystal for herself and Michael, but I would be given a paper plate and plastic utensils. When I mentioned it, she laughed it off, saying she was saving the good dishes, and that it was more casual that way. The food disparity became more obvious over time. During one particularly memorable visit, I watched Brenda serve herself and Michael grilled salmon with asparagus and quinoa pilaf from an expensive catering service, while she handed me a small container of leftover pasta salad that looked like it had been sitting in their refrigerator for days. The pasta was soggy, the vegetables were wilted, and it tasted like it had absorbed every other flavor in their refrigerator. When I looked questioningly at the beautiful salmon dinner they were enjoying, Brenda smiled sweetly and said, "I thought you might prefer something lighter, Evelyn. You're always talking about how you don't eat as much as you used to." I was stunned. I had never said anything about eating less or wanting lighter meals. In fact, I had always been proud of my healthy appetite and my ability to enjoy good food. But I didn't want to cause a scene, so I ate the sad pasta salad in silence while they enjoyed their expensive meal. Michael seemed oblivious to the difference in our meals, chatting happily about work while cutting into his perfectly prepared salmon. This pattern continued and worsened over the following months. I would arrive for family dinners to find that elaborate meals had been prepared or ordered for Michael and Brenda, while I was served reheated leftovers, wilted salads, or the cheapest items from whatever restaurant they had ordered from. Once, I was given a child's portion of chicken nuggets and French fries, while they shared a beautiful rack of lamb with roasted vegetables. Another time, I received a cup of instant soup while they enjoyed fresh lobster tails. The most humiliating incident occurred during Thanksgiving. I had offered multiple times to host the holiday at my house, as had been our family tradition for decades, but Brenda insisted they would host instead. I arrived to find their dining room table set with their finest china, crystal glasses, silver flatware, and beautiful autumn decorations. The smell of roasting turkey filled the house, and I felt a moment of hope that perhaps this would be a return to the warm family gatherings I remembered. But when we sat down to eat, I discovered that my place setting consisted of a paper plate and plastic fork. While Michael and Brenda filled their plates with herb-crusted turkey, stuffing made with artisanal bread and exotic mushrooms, cranberry sauce with orange zest and fresh herbs, mashed potatoes with truffle oil, and green bean casserole topped with crispy shallots, I was handed a sandwich bag containing what appeared to be turkey scraps and a small container of plain mashed potatoes that had clearly been sitting out for a while. I stared at the sad meal in front of me while they carved their beautiful turkey and discussed the wine pairing Brenda had selected. The turkey scraps were dry and flavorless, mostly skin and gristle with very little actual meat. The mashed potatoes were lumpy and cold, obviously instant mix that had been hastily prepared. There were no vegetables, no stuffing, no cranberry sauce, nothing that resembled the Thanksgiving meals I had been preparing for my family for over 40 years. Michael was so engaged in conversation with Brenda about her impressive menu planning that he didn't seem to notice the difference in our meals. When I finally found my voice to ask about getting some of the stuffing and cranberry sauce, Brenda looked at me with feigned concern and said, "Oh, I'm so sorry, Evelyn. I wasn't sure about your dietary restrictions at your age, so I prepared something simpler for you. I thought all that rich food might be too heavy." The words hit me like a slap across the face. Dietary restrictions at my age? I was 73 years old, not 93, and I had never mentioned having any dietary issues. I had been cooking and eating rich food my entire life without any problems. But more than that, it was the dismissive way she said it, the implication that I was somehow fragile or incapable of enjoying the same meal as the rest of the family. I excused myself to use the bathroom and stood in their guest powder room, staring at my reflection in the mirror while trying to process what was happening. I looked at my face, still strong and healthy despite my age, my hands that had prepared thousands of meals with love and care, and I realized that somewhere along the way, I had allowed myself to become invisible in my own family. When I returned to the table, I forced myself to eat the scraps they had given me while listening to Michael praise Brenda's cooking skills and her thoughtfulness in preparing such a beautiful meal. The irony was that Brenda hadn't cooked anything at all. The entire meal had been catered by an expensive Atlanta restaurant, something I discovered when I saw the delivery containers stacked in their kitchen trash can. She had spent hundreds of dollars on a catered Thanksgiving dinner, but couldn't be bothered to ensure her mother-in-law received the same food. That night, I drove home in silence, my heart heavy with the realization that I had somehow become a second-class citizen in my own son's life. I sat in my kitchen, surrounded by the recipes and memories that had defined my family for generations, and I felt more alone than I had since Robert died. The tradition of family meals, of sharing food prepared with love, of gathering around a table where everyone was equal and welcome, had been replaced by something cold and calculated. I spent the next few days trying to understand how things had gotten to this point. I replayed every interaction, every dinner, every moment when I had felt uncomfortable or unwelcome, and I began to see a pattern that I had been too hopeful to recognize before. Brenda hadn't simply been uninterested in cooking or family traditions. She had been systematically excluding me, reducing my status in the family hierarchy, making me feel like a burden rather than a beloved family member. The worst part was that Michael seemed completely oblivious to what was happening. He would call me during the week, chatting happily about work and his marriage, never mentioning the way his wife treated me during our visits. When I tried to bring up the subject indirectly, asking about having dinner at my house or suggesting we return to some of our old traditions, he would brush off my concerns with comments about how modern their lifestyle was and how much he appreciated Brenda's efficiency. I began to realize that Brenda had carefully orchestrated this situation in a way that made me look petty if I complained. After all, they were still including me in family gatherings, still inviting me to their home, still making time for me in their busy lives. If I complained about the food or the paper plates, I would sound ungrateful and difficult. She had found a way to humiliate me while maintaining plausible deniability, and she had done it so gradually that even I hadn't fully recognized what was happening until it was too late. The breaking point came during Michael's birthday dinner in February. I had always baked his birthday cakes, a tradition that went back to his childhood when I would let him help me measure ingredients and lick the mixing spoons. His favorite had always been my German chocolate cake with homemade coconut pecan frosting, a recipe that took me an entire day to prepare properly. The cake layers had to be baked to perfection, cooled completely, and then assembled with the frosting that required careful attention to achieve the right consistency. I spent 2 days preparing Michael's birthday cake, just as I had every year of his life. I baked the layers, made the frosting from scratch, and assembled the cake with the same love and attention I had always given to his special day. I was excited to surprise him, to see his face light up when he saw his favorite cake, to continue the tradition that connected him to his childhood and to the generations of our family who had celebrated birthdays the same way. When I arrived at their house carrying the cake box, Brenda met me at the door with what I now recognize as barely concealed irritation. She thanked me for the cake but explained that she had already ordered a gourmet dessert from a high-end bakery in Atlanta and that there wouldn't be room for both. She suggested I could take my cake home and perhaps bring it another time, or maybe just leave it in their kitchen for them to enjoy later. I stood in their foyer holding the cake I had spent 2 days preparing, feeling like I had been physically slapped. This wasn't just about dessert. This was about erasing the last connection I had to my son's birthday celebration, the one tradition that had remained constant throughout his entire life. I looked past Brenda into their dining room and saw the table set beautifully for 3 people, with an elegant store-bought cake already positioned in the center as the centerpiece. Michael appeared behind Brenda, smiling broadly when he saw me. "Mom, I'm so glad you're here. Brenda planned the most amazing dinner." He seemed genuinely happy to see me, but when his eyes fell on the cake box in my hands, he looked confused. "Oh, you brought a cake too? That's sweet, but Brenda already got one from that fancy place downtown." "You know how much I love trying new things." The words felt like arrows piercing my heart. Michael had never been interested in trying new things when it came to his birthday cake. For 37 years, he had requested the same German chocolate cake, had smiled with the same delight when I brought it out with candles blazing, had always insisted on having a piece for breakfast the next morning. Now he was acting like my homemade cake was an unnecessary afterthought, a sweet but misguided gesture from an old woman who didn't understand modern preferences. I forced a smile and congratulated them on their beautiful dinner plans. I placed my cake on their kitchen counter and took my seat at the table, where I found the now familiar paper plate waiting for me. As the evening progressed, I watched Michael blow out the candles on Brenda's expensive bakery cake, while she beamed with pride at her thoughtful gift selection. The cake was beautiful, I'll admit, with perfect fondant flowers and elegant script lettering, but when we tasted it, it was dry and overly sweet, clearly more focused on appearance than flavor. After dinner, Michael asked about my cake, and I suggested we try a piece. I cut 3 slices of the German chocolate cake I had made with such care, and I watched Michael's face as he took his first bite. His expression changed immediately, a look of recognition and memory crossing his features. He closed his eyes for a moment, and I could see him transported back to childhood birthdays, to the comfort and familiarity of home. "This is incredible, Mom," he said, taking another bite. "I had forgotten how amazing your German chocolate cake is. This frosting is perfect." He looked at Brenda, who had taken a small, polite bite. "Honey, you have to try this. Mom's cake is legendary." Brenda smiled tightly and took another small bite, chewing thoughtfully. "It's very sweet," she said finally. "I can see why you enjoyed it as a child, but it's quite rich. I'm surprised you can still eat things like this at your age, Michael. All that sugar and butter can't be good for you." The comment was directed at Michael, but it felt like a deliberate attack on me and everything I represented. She wasn't just criticizing my cake. She was criticizing my entire approach to cooking, my family traditions, and, by extension, my value in their lives. She was suggesting that my food, my love, my contribution to their family was not just unnecessary but actually harmful. I went home that night and sat in my kitchen, staring at my recipe collection that filled 3 large binders and dozens of index card boxes. These recipes represented 4 generations of women in my family, countless hours of experimentation and refinement, and thousands of meals prepared with love. Each recipe told a story, connected me to my grandmother and mother, and had been meant to connect Michael to his heritage. But looking at them now, I realized they had become worthless in Brenda's world. She had no interest in learning them, no respect for the traditions they represented, and no understanding of the love that had been poured into their creation and preservation. Worse, she seemed determined to ensure that Michael forgot about them too, to replace his childhood memories of homemade meals with her version of modern, efficient living. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to fight Brenda for my son's attention or try to force her to appreciate my cooking. Instead, I was going to give her exactly what she seemed to want: complete responsibility for feeding and caring for Michael. But I was going to do it in a way that would teach her the true value of what she had been so quick to dismiss. I spent the next week going through my entire recipe collection, organizing it in a way I had never done before. I separated the recipes into categories: everyday meals, special occasion dishes, holiday favorites, and what I called emergency comfort food for times of illness or stress. I wrote detailed notes about each recipe, including not just ingredients and directions, but also the stories behind them, the occasions when they were most appropriate, and the particular techniques that made them special. This wasn't just about recipes. This was about passing on a legacy, sharing the knowledge that had been accumulated over generations, and ensuring that Michael would always have access to the food that connected him to his family history. But most importantly, it was about showing Brenda the depth and complexity of what she had been so casually dismissing. As I worked on organizing the recipes, I began to feel a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in months. I was taking control of the situation in the only way I could, by giving Brenda what she claimed to want while ensuring that she would truly understand the magnitude of what she was taking on. If she wanted to be the sole provider of meals in Michael's life, then she would need to learn how to replicate not just the food, but the love and care that went into every dish. The plan I was forming wasn't about revenge, though I knew it might seem that way to some people. It was about truth. It was about forcing Brenda to confront the reality of what it means to truly care for someone through food. To understand that cooking isn't just about efficiency and modern convenience, but about love, tradition, and the daily act of nourishing the people you care about. I had spent months watching Brenda reduce me to scraps and leftovers while she played the role of the perfect wife. Now it was time for her to prove she could actually fulfill that role without depending on expensive restaurants and catering services. It was time for her to learn what it really meant to feed a family, not just order food for them. As I continued working on my recipe collection, I found myself remembering the women who had come before me, who had passed down not just recipes but the understanding that food is love made tangible. My grandmother Mabel Ruth, who could stretch a single chicken into 3 meals during the Depression. My mother, who worked all day and still managed to have dinner on the table every night. They would have understood what I was doing, would have approved of my decision to finally stand up for myself and the traditions we had worked so hard to preserve. The hardest part was accepting that Michael might not understand, at least not at first. He had been so seduced by Brenda's modern lifestyle, so impressed by her efficiency and her ability to provide restaurant-quality meals without effort, that he might not immediately recognize what he was losing. But I had to believe that somewhere deep down, he would remember the taste of love, the comfort of tradition, and the irreplaceable value of food prepared by someone who truly cared about his well-being. I was about to give Brenda the opportunity to prove that she could be the wife and homemaker she pretended to be. And if she failed, if she couldn't rise to the challenge of truly caring for Michael in the way he deserved, then perhaps he would finally understand what he had allowed himself to lose. The following Saturday morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The spring sunshine streamed through my lace curtains, casting dancing shadows across the hardwood floors that Robert and I had refinished together 20 years ago. I made myself a proper breakfast, something I hadn't done in weeks, with fluffy buttermilk pancakes, crispy bacon, and fresh strawberries from my garden. As I sat at my kitchen table, eating slowly and savoring each bite, I felt like I was reclaiming something essential about myself. I spent the morning finalizing my recipe collection, carefully transcribing the handwritten notes that had been passed down through generations of women in my family. Each recipe was more than just a list of ingredients and instructions. It was a piece of history, a connection to the past, and a blueprint for creating love through food. I wrote detailed explanations for techniques that most modern cooks had never learned, like how to properly cream butter and sugar by hand, how to test oil temperature without a thermometer, and how to adjust baking times based on humidity and altitude. The process was both heartbreaking and liberating. I was essentially giving away the most precious inheritance I had to offer, the knowledge that had defined my identity as a mother and grandmother, but I was also freeing myself from the burden of watching it be dismissed and devalued. If Brenda wanted to take over the role of feeding my son, then she would have to do it properly, with the same dedication and skill that had nourished him for 37 years. By noon, I had organized everything into a beautiful wooden recipe box that had belonged to my grandmother. The box itself was a work of art, hand-carved with intricate flowers and vines, with brass hinges that had been polished smooth by decades of use. Inside, I placed every recipe that had ever been important to Michael, along with detailed notes about his preferences, allergies he had developed over the years, and the emotional significance of certain dishes. I included my grandmother's Sunday pot roast recipe, the one that required starting the meat at high heat and then slow cooking it for hours until it fell apart at the touch of a fork. I wrote detailed instructions about how to select the right cut of meat, how to brown it properly, and how to layer the vegetables so they cooked evenly without becoming mushy. I explained that this was the meal Michael always requested when he was feeling homesick or stressed, and that the leftovers made the best sandwiches he had ever tasted. I included the chicken and dumplings recipe that had gotten Michael through every childhood illness, with notes about how to make the broth rich and flavorful, how to roll the dumplings to the perfect thickness, and how to time everything so the dumplings were light and fluffy rather than dense and heavy. I wrote about how Michael used to help me drop the dumplings into the simmering broth, standing on a chair beside the stove and carefully following my instructions about spacing them properly. I included my mother's meatloaf recipe, the one with the secret ingredient of grated carrots that kept it moist, and added a subtle sweetness that complemented the savory seasonings. I explained how to shape the loaf so it cooked evenly, how to glaze it with a mixture of ketchup and brown sugar during the last 15 minutes of baking, and how to let it rest before slicing so it held together perfectly. This was the meal Michael had requested for his birthday dinner every year until he turned 18 and decided he wanted something more sophisticated. The dessert recipes were particularly precious to me. I included my grandmother's pound cake recipe, the one that required beating the batter by hand for exactly 20 minutes to achieve the perfect texture. I wrote detailed instructions about how to prepare the pan, how to test for doneness, and how to cool the cake so it didn't collapse. I explained that this cake was Michael's favorite when served with fresh berries and whipped cream, and that it was the dessert I had made for every major celebration in his life. I included the chocolate chip cookie recipe that Michael had helped me perfect when he was 12 years old, testing different ratios of brown sugar to white sugar until we found the combination that created cookies that were crispy on the edges and chewy in the center. I wrote about how to chill the dough for the optimal texture, how to space the cookies on the baking sheet, and how to remove them at exactly the right moment so they finished cooking on the hot pan without becoming overdone. Each recipe came with stories, memories, and the kind of detailed knowledge that can only be gained through years of practice and attention. I wrote about the disasters that had taught me important lessons, like the time I learned that opening the oven door too early would cause a soufflé to collapse, or the Thanksgiving, when I discovered that brining a turkey for too long would make it unbearably salty. I included practical advice that no cookbook would ever contain, like how to salvage a sauce that had broken, how to fix bread dough that hadn't risen properly, and how to adjust seasoning by taste rather than measurement. I explained the difference between various types of flour and when to use each one, how to store spices to maintain their potency, and how to organize a kitchen for maximum efficiency. But most importantly, I included the emotional context that made each recipe meaningful. I wrote about the Christmas morning cinnamon rolls that had become a family tradition, explaining not just how to make the dough and prepare the filling, but also about how the smell of them baking would fill the house and draw everyone to the kitchen in their pajamas. I wrote about the birthday cakes that marked every milestone in Michael's life, from his first birthday smash cake to his high school graduation party. I included the comfort food recipes that had sustained our family through difficult times, the chicken soup that I made whenever anyone was sick, with instructions for making rich broth from scratch and timing the vegetables so they retained their texture and nutritional value, the mac and cheese that had comforted Michael through his parents' divorce, his father's illness, and every disappointment he had faced as a child and young adult. As I worked, I found myself crying, not from sadness but from the overwhelming weight of memories and love that each recipe represented. These weren't just instructions for preparing food. They were blueprints for creating the kind of home where people felt loved, nourished, and cared for. They were the foundation of family traditions that had been passed down through generations and were meant to continue long after I was gone. By late afternoon, I had finished organizing everything into the wooden box. I sat back and looked at what I had created, and I felt a mixture of pride and profound loss. This collection represented everything I knew about cooking, everything I had learned from the women who came before me, and everything I had hoped to pass on to future generations. Now it would belong to Brenda, a woman who had shown nothing but disdain for the traditions and knowledge it represented. But I also felt a sense of anticipation. Brenda had made it clear that she considered my cooking outdated and unnecessary. She had dismissed my recipes as too rich, too complicated, too old-fashioned for modern life. Now she would have the opportunity to prove that she could do better, that her modern approach to food and meal planning was superior to the methods that had sustained families for generations. I called Michael that evening and asked if I could come over the next day to drop off something special for Brenda. He sounded pleased and surprised, probably relieved that I was making an effort to connect with his wife. He had always been uncomfortable with the tension between us, though he had never acknowledged it directly or taken any steps to address it. Sunday morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical April weather in Georgia that couldn't decide between winter and spring. I dressed carefully in my best navy dress and pearl earrings, the same outfit I had worn to their wedding. I wanted to look dignified and gracious, like a mother-in-law who was genuinely trying to bridge the gap between herself and her son's wife. I drove to their house with the recipe box carefully secured in a decorative gift bag, along with a card I had written explaining my intentions. The card was important because I wanted there to be a written record of what I was giving her and why. I had spent considerable time crafting the message, making sure it sounded generous and supportive, rather than challenging or confrontational. When I arrived at their house, I could see through the large front windows that they were in their living room, Michael reading the newspaper, while Brenda scrolled through her tablet. They looked comfortable and content, like a couple enjoying a peaceful Sunday morning together. For a moment I almost lost my resolve, wondering if I was making a mistake by disrupting their happiness with my gesture. But then I remembered the paper plates, the leftover scraps, the dismissive comments about my food being too rich or inappropriate for someone my age. I thought about the German chocolate cake that had been pushed aside for a store-bought dessert, and the years of Sunday dinners where I had been made to feel like an unwelcome guest in my own son's life. My resolve strengthened. and I walked up their front steps with confidence. Brenda answered the door looking perfectly put together despite the early hour, her blonde hair styled in loose waves, and her makeup flawlessly applied. She was wearing yoga pants and a designer athleisure top that probably cost more than I spent on clothes in 6 months. She seemed surprised to see me, glancing at her watch as if to confirm that it was unusually early for a visit. "Evelyn," she said with her practiced smile, "what a nice surprise. Michael didn't mention you were coming by this morning." "I called yesterday evening," I replied, matching her polite tone. "I have something special I wanted to give you, a little gift to show my appreciation for everything you do for Michael." Her expression shifted slightly, curiosity replacing the mild annoyance that had flickered across her features. She stepped aside to let me in, calling for Michael as we walked toward the living room. He appeared with a genuine smile, kissing my cheek and helping me with my coat. "Mom, you're out early today," he said warmly. "Everything okay?" "Everything's wonderful," I replied, settling into the chair that had become my designated spot during family visits. "I just wanted to bring Brenda a little gift, something I've been working on for a while." I reached into the gift bag and carefully lifted out the wooden recipe box, placing it on their coffee table where the morning light from their large windows made the carved details visible. Both Michael and Brenda stared at it, clearly recognizing its age and craftsmanship. "This belonged to my grandmother," I explained, running my fingers along the smooth wood. "It's been in our family for over 100 years. And what's inside is even more precious." I opened the box, revealing the neat rows of recipe cards, each one written in my careful handwriting and organized by category with handmade dividers. The cards were color-coded, with different colors representing different types of dishes, and each one was protected in a clear plastic sleeve to preserve it for years to come. Michael leaned forward, his expression shifting to one of wonder and recognition. "Mom, are these all your recipes? The ones from Grandma Mabel and Great-Grandma?" "Every single one," I confirmed, watching Brenda's face carefully as she began to understand what she was looking at. 4 generations of family recipes, including all of Michael's favorites and many dishes you've never tried but that have been part of our family traditions for decades. I lifted out a small stack of cards to show them the detail that had gone into the project. Each recipe was written on a high-quality index card with my best penmanship, including not just ingredients and directions but also detailed notes about preparation techniques, storage instructions, and personal anecdotes about when and why each dish was special. "This is incredible, Mom," Michael said, taking one of the cards and reading it carefully. It was the recipe for my famous cornbread, and I had included notes about how to adjust the batter for different pan sizes, how to test the oil temperature properly, and the story about how his great-grandmother had developed the recipe during the Depression when ingredients were scarce. Brenda had been unusually quiet during this exchange, studying the recipe box with an expression I couldn't quite read. Finally, she looked up at me with what appeared to be genuine confusion. "This is very thoughtful, Evelyn," she said slowly, "but I'm not sure I understand." "Are you giving this to me?" "I am," I replied, offering her the card I had written to accompany the gift. "I've been thinking about how busy you are with work and maintaining such a beautiful home, and I realize that you might appreciate having access to all of Michael's favorite family recipes. This way, you'll be able to prepare the dishes that have been important to him throughout his life." She took the card and read it silently while Michael continued examining the recipe cards. I had spent considerable time crafting the message to sound supportive and helpful, rather than challenging. "Dear Brenda, I hope you'll accept this collection of family recipes as a gesture of love and support. These dishes have been part of Michael's life since childhood, and I know how much it would mean to him to continue enjoying them in his own home. I've included detailed instructions and personal notes to help you master each recipe. I trust that you'll put them to good use and create many wonderful memories around your dining room table. With love and best wishes, Evelyn." When she finished reading, Brenda looked up at me with an expression that had shifted from confusion to something approaching alarm. She seemed to understand, perhaps for the first time, that this wasn't just a generous gift from a mother-in-law trying to be helpful. This was a challenge, a test, and a transfer of responsibility that she had never asked for. "Evelyn, this is incredibly generous," she said carefully, But I'm not really much of a cook. You know that. I've never claimed to be good in the kitchen like you are. That's exactly why I thought this would be helpful, I replied with a warm smile. Everything you need to know is written right there. The instructions are very detailed, and I've included tips that will help you avoid the common mistakes that beginning cooks often make. Michael, who had been absorbed in reading the recipes, suddenly looked up with excitement. Brenda, this is amazing, look at this. He held up the card for my German chocolate cake. Mom wrote down the story about how I used to help her make this every year for my birthday. And look, she included variations for different occasions and detailed instructions for making the frosting from scratch. I watched Brenda's face as she realized that Michael was genuinely excited about the prospect of her learning to cook his favorite family recipes. The enthusiasm in his voice was unmistakable, and I could see her beginning to understand that refusing this gift or dismissing its importance would disappoint him. Michael, honey, she said, trying to maintain her composed tone. You know I don't really have time for this kind of elaborate cooking. Between work and everything else we have going on, it's just more practical to order from restaurants or use meal services. But think about how special it would be, Michael replied, still examining the recipe cards with obvious delight. These are the dishes I grew up with. The ones that remind me of home and family. And Mom has written down all her secrets, all the techniques that make them so much better than anything you can order. I could see Brenda struggling to find a way to decline the gift, without appearing ungrateful or unsupportive. She had built her identity around being efficient and modern, and the idea of spending hours in the kitchen preparing elaborate meals from scratch clearly held no appeal for her. But she also couldn't dismiss something that was obviously important to Michael, without revealing her true feelings about family traditions and the effort required to maintain them. I appreciate the thought, Evelyn, I really do, she said finally, but I'm just not sure when I would have time to learn all of these recipes. They look quite complicated. They're really not, I assured her, maintaining my helpful tone. Most of them are quite simple once you understand the basic techniques. And I've included notes about which recipes are good for beginners and which ones require a bit more experience. You could start with something easy, like the meatloaf or the chicken casserole, and work your way up to the more challenging dishes. Michael had moved on to reading the recipe for my famous fried chicken, and his face lit up with memory and anticipation. Brenda, you have to try making this. Mom's fried chicken is legendary. Remember that time you said you wished you could find a restaurant that made fried chicken as good as what I remembered from childhood? Well, here's the recipe. I had to suppress a smile as I watched this exchange. Michael was doing exactly what I had hoped he would do, becoming genuinely excited about the possibility of enjoying his favorite childhood foods in his own home. He was also inadvertently putting pressure on Brenda to accept the challenge, making it clear that these recipes and the meals they represented were important to him. Brenda looked trapped, and I could see her mind working to find a graceful way out of the situation. She glanced between Michael's enthusiastic face and the imposing collection of recipes, clearly calculating the cost of refusing versus the effort required to accept. Perhaps we could start slowly, she said with obvious reluctance. Maybe you could teach me one or two of the simpler recipes, Evelyn. We could have you over for dinner, and you could walk me through the process. This was exactly what I had been hoping to avoid. I didn't want to continue being involved in their meal planning or cooking. I wanted Brenda to take full responsibility for feeding Michael, to understand what it really meant to nourish someone you claim to love. Oh, that's very sweet of you to offer, I replied, but I think it would be better if you learned on your own. That way, you can develop your own style and make the recipes your own. Besides, the instructions are very detailed, and I'm confident you'll be able to figure them out. You're such an intelligent, capable woman. I could see that my compliment, while sincere, also made it harder for her to argue that the recipes were too difficult for her to manage independently. Michael nodded enthusiastically, clearly agreeing with my assessment of his wife's capabilities. Mom's right, he said, reaching over to squeeze Brenda's hand. You're incredibly organized and detail-oriented. If anyone can master these recipes, it's you. And think about how impressed our friends will be when you serve them homemade meals instead of catered food. This comment seemed to strike a nerve with Brenda, and I could see a flash of irritation cross her features before she regained her composure. She had built her reputation among their social circle around hosting elegant dinner parties with professionally catered menus, and the suggestion that homemade food would be more impressive clearly challenged her sense of sophistication. "I suppose I could try a few of them," she said, her tone suggesting that she was making a significant sacrifice. "But Evelyn, you'll have to be patient with me. I'm not used to cooking from scratch like this." "Of course," I assured her. "And please don't hesitate to call if you have any questions. Though I'm sure you'll do wonderfully." I stood up, preparing to leave before Brenda could change her mind or find a way to return the gift. Michael immediately protested, asking me to stay for coffee or brunch, but I declined, explaining that I had other plans for the afternoon. "I just wanted to drop this off and let you two explore the recipes together," I said, gathering my purse and coat. "I think you'll find some real treasures in there, dishes that will become new family favorites." As I moved toward the door, I could hear Michael continuing to flip through the recipe cards, occasionally reading aloud descriptions or ingredients that caught his attention. His enthusiasm was exactly what I had hoped for, and I could see Brenda becoming increasingly uncomfortable with his obvious excitement about the prospect of her cooking these elaborate meals. At the door, Brenda walked me out while Michael remained absorbed in the recipe collection. For a moment we stood alone on their front porch, and I could see her struggling with what to say. "Evelyn," she began, her voice lower than usual, "I want to be honest with you. I'm not sure I can live up to your standards in the kitchen. These recipes look incredibly time-consuming and complicated." "I'm sure you'll do fine," I replied with a smile that I hoped looked encouraging rather than challenging. "Michael is going to be so happy to have his favorite family foods in his own home. And think about how meaningful it will be for him to know that you took the time to learn these recipes just for him." She nodded slowly, but I could see the wheels turning in her mind, already trying to figure out how to manage the expectations I had just created. Michael called from inside, asking her to come look at something he had found in the recipe collection, and she excused herself to go back inside. I drove home feeling a mixture of satisfaction and anticipation. I had successfully transferred the responsibility from Michael's culinary happiness to Brenda, and I had done it in a way that made me look generous and supportive, rather than manipulative or vindictive. Now it was up to her to prove that she could fulfill the role she had claimed for herself. Over the next few days, I waited to see what would happen. Would Brenda rise to the challenge and actually attempt to cook some of the recipes? Would she find excuses to avoid trying them? Would Michael continue to express enthusiasm about the prospect of homemade family meals? Or would his interest fade when he realized the effort required? The first sign came on Tuesday evening when Michael called me, his voice full of excitement. "Mom, I can't stop looking at these recipes. I had no idea you had written down so many family stories and cooking tips. It's like having a piece of family history." "I'm so glad you're enjoying them," I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral despite my satisfaction at his response. "Brenda's been studying them too," he continued. "She's planning to try making your pot roast this weekend. She seems a little nervous about it, but I told her how forgiving that recipe is, and how it always turns out delicious." I felt a flutter of anticipation. The pot roast was one of the more challenging recipes in the collection, requiring careful timing and attention to detail to achieve the perfect texture. It wasn't impossible for a beginner, but it would definitely test Brenda's commitment and skill level. "That's wonderful," I said. "I'm sure it will turn out beautifully. The key is not to rush it and to trust the process." Thursday evening brought another call from Michael, this time with a note of concern in his voice. "Mom, Brenda's been reading that pot roast recipe over and over, and she's getting really stressed about it. She says she doesn't understand some of the terminology you used. What does it mean to, quote, brown the meat properly? And how is she supposed to know when the vegetables are fork tender?" I had anticipated this moment. Brenda was discovering that cooking from scratch required knowledge and intuition that couldn't be learned from reading instructions alone. The techniques I had described in the recipes were second nature to me after decades of practice, but they would be mystifying to someone who had never actually cooked a piece of meat or tested vegetables for doneness. "Well," I said carefully, "browning meat properly means searing it at high heat until it develops a rich, caramelized crust on all sides. It's what creates the deep flavor that makes the difference between good pot roast and extraordinary pot roast. And fork tender means the vegetables yield easily when pierced with a fork but haven't become mushy. Michael was quiet for a moment, and I could practically hear him processing this information. That sounds more complicated than I thought. Maybe you could come over and help her with it? Oh, I don't think that's necessary, I replied. Brenda is such a smart woman, and she's so good at figuring things out. I'm sure she'll manage just fine. Besides, the best way to learn to cook is by doing it yourself and learning from your mistakes. But what if she ruins it? She's already so nervous, and if the dinner turns out badly, I'm afraid she'll never want to try cooking again. This was exactly the position I had hoped to create. Michael was beginning to understand that cooking the meals he loved wasn't as simple as following a list of ingredients and instructions. It required skill, experience, and the kind of intuitive understanding that came from years of practice. Brenda was about to discover that replacing my contribution to their family meals wasn't going to be as easy as she had assumed. Michael, I said gently, Brenda has been telling me for months that my cooking is too rich and old-fashioned for modern tastes. She's made it very clear that she prefers contemporary approaches to food and meal planning. I'm sure she'll find a way to adapt the recipes to suit your current lifestyle. The silence on the other end of the line told me that Michael was beginning to understand the implications of what I had said. Brenda had been dismissive of my cooking and confident in her own approach to feeding their family. Now she was going to have the opportunity to prove that her methods were superior. Friday evening, Michael called again, and this time his voice was strained with frustration. Mom, Brenda spent 3 hours at the grocery store today trying to figure out what cut of meat to buy for the pot roast. She said the butcher kept asking her questions she couldn't answer, and she ended up buying something that cost twice as much as she expected. I felt a surge of satisfaction. Selecting the right cut of meat for pot roast was indeed a skill that required knowledge and experience. There were several cuts that would work, but they required different cooking times and techniques. The butcher had probably tried to help her, but without understanding the fundamentals of how different cuts of meat behaved during long, slow cooking, Brenda would have been lost. I'm sure whatever she chose will work out fine, I said. The beautiful thing about pot roast is that it's very forgiving. She also called me from the store asking about the vegetables. Your recipe calls for small new potatoes, but she said all the potatoes looked the same to her. And she didn't know what fresh thyme meant versus the dried thyme in the spice aisle. Each detail Michael shared reinforced my understanding of how little Brenda actually knew about cooking. She had been so confident in her modern approach to meal planning, so dismissive of traditional cooking methods, that she had never bothered to learn the basic knowledge that any home cook needed to understand. Well, I said, maintaining my helpful tone, new potatoes are the small, thin-skinned potatoes that are harvested early in the season. They hold their shape better during long cooking than larger, mature potatoes. And fresh thyme has a much more delicate flavor than dried thyme, though she could substitute dried if she can't find fresh. Could you maybe write down some of these explanations for her? Michael asked. I think she'd feel more confident if she had more detailed guidance. This was exactly what I had hoped to avoid. I had deliberately written the recipes using the terminology and assumptions that any experienced cook would understand, forcing Brenda to confront the gaps in her knowledge. If I started providing additional explanations and guidance, I would be making the process easier for her and undermining the lesson I was trying to teach. Michael, I think it's important for Brenda to develop her own relationship with cooking, I said. The best way to learn is through experience, and I don't want to interfere with her process. She's going to feel so much more accomplished if she figures things out on her own. Saturday afternoon arrived, and I found myself unable to concentrate on anything other than wondering how Brenda's pot roast attempt was progressing. I imagined her in their beautiful gourmet kitchen, surrounded by expensive appliances she didn't know how to use properly, struggling with techniques that seemed simple to me, but would be mystifying to someone with no experience. The call came at 6:30, just as I was finishing my own simple dinner of leftover soup and cornbread. Michael's voice was strained, and I could hear tension in the background. Mom, he said, and I could tell he was trying to keep his voice low. The pot roast didn't turn out very well. The meat is tough and the vegetables are either raw or mushy. Brenda's really upset, and we ended up ordering pizza. I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Part of me was satisfied that my prediction had come true, that Brenda's first attempt at serious cooking had failed. But part of me also felt genuinely sorry for her, remembering my own early disasters in the kitchen, and the frustration of trying to create something beautiful, and having it turn out completely wrong. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and I meant it. Pot roast can be tricky the first time. There are a lot of variables that affect how it turns out. "She's saying the recipe was unclear and that she followed it exactly, but it didn't work," Michael continued. "She wants to know if you made a mistake in writing it down." This accusation stung, even though I had been expecting it. The pot roast recipe was one I had made successfully hundreds of times, and I had written it down with the same care and detail as all the others. Brenda's failure wasn't due to an error in the recipe, but to her lack of understanding about the fundamental principles of cooking meat and vegetables. "The recipe is the same one I've been using for 20 years, I replied calmly. "It's entirely possible that something went wrong with the timing or temperature. Cooking is as much about intuition and experience as it is about following directions." "What do you think she should try next?" Michael asked, and I could hear the hope in his voice that I would suggest something simpler, something more likely to succeed. "Well," I said, considering my options carefully, "maybe she should start with something a bit less challenging. The meatloaf might be a good choice, or the chicken casserole. Those recipes are more straightforward and harder to mess up." What I didn't say was that even the simpler recipes would present challenges for someone with Brenda's limited cooking experience. The meatloaf required understanding how to properly mix meat without overworking it, and the chicken casserole involved creating a sauce from scratch and coordinating the cooking times of multiple ingredients. Sunday morning brought a text from Michael. "Brenda wants to return the recipe box to you. She says it's too stressful and she doesn't have time to learn all this from scratch." I stared at the message for a long time, feeling a mixture of disappointment and vindication. Part of me had hoped that Brenda would rise to the challenge, that she would discover a love of cooking, and begin to understand the satisfaction that came from nourishing someone you cared about. But a larger part of me had expected exactly this outcome. I texted back, "The recipes are a gift. She should keep them for when she has more time to explore cooking." The response came quickly. "She's really frustrated and says it's not fair for you to expect her to become a gourmet cook overnight." This message revealed everything I needed to know about how Brenda had interpreted my gift. She saw it as an expectation, a demand that she suddenly acquire skills and knowledge that took years to develop. She didn't understand that cooking was a gradual learning process, something you improved at over time through practice and patience. But more importantly, she didn't seem to grasp that learning to cook Michael's favorite foods would be an act of love, a way of showing care and commitment to his happiness and well-being. Instead, she saw it as an unreasonable burden, something that was being imposed on her, rather than something she might want to do for the man she had married. I called Michael that afternoon, and the conversation that followed changed everything. "Mom," he said, his voice heavy with frustration, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me. Did you give Brenda those recipes because you genuinely wanted to help her, or were you trying to prove a point?" The directness of his question caught me off guard. I had expected him to focus on Brenda's inability to cook the recipes, not to question my motivations for giving them to her. "I gave her the recipes because I thought she should have access to your favorite family foods," I said carefully. "I wanted her to be able to prepare the meals that have been important to you throughout your life. But Mom, you know she's not a cook. You've known that from the beginning. So why would you suddenly give her a collection of complicated recipes and expect her to master them?" I was quiet for a moment, trying to formulate a response that would be honest without revealing the full extent of my frustration with how Brenda had been treating me. "Michael," I said finally, "Brenda has made it very clear that she thinks my cooking is outdated and inappropriate for your current lifestyle. She's been managing your meals for over a year now, and she seems confident in her approach. I thought she might appreciate having the option to prepare some traditional family dishes if she ever wanted to." "But that's just it, Mom. She doesn't want to." She's never shown any interest in cooking elaborate meals from scratch, and you know that. So giving her those recipes feels like you're setting her up to fail." His words hit me harder than I had expected. Michael was right, of course. I had given Brenda the recipes knowing that she lacked the skills and interest necessary to execute them successfully. I had done it deliberately, as a way of demonstrating the value of what she had been so quick to dismiss. "Are you saying I should take the recipes back?" I asked. "I'm saying I want to understand what's really going on here. You and Brenda have been polite to each other, but I can tell there's tension. And this whole recipe thing feels like it's about more than just wanting her to cook my favorite foods." I realized that this was the moment of truth, the conversation I had been both hoping for and dreading. Michael was finally asking direct questions about the dynamic between his wife and me, and I had to decide how much of the truth I was willing to reveal. "Michael," I said slowly, "have you ever noticed how Brenda serves our meals when I come to dinner?" There was a pause. "What do you mean?" "I mean, have you ever noticed that you and Brenda eat from your good china while I'm given paper plates? Or that you both enjoy restaurant-quality meals while I'm served leftover scraps?" The silence that followed was so long that I wondered if we had been disconnected. Finally, Michael spoke, his voice uncertain. I hadn't really noticed. Are you sure about that?" "I'm absolutely sure, Michael. For months now, I've been treated like a second-class guest in your home. While you and Brenda enjoy beautiful, expensive meals, I've been served leftovers, reheated scraps, and the cheapest items from whatever restaurant you've ordered from." "That can't be right," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Brenda wouldn't do that. She's always been welcoming and inclusive." "Think about it, Michael. Really think about the last few times I've been to your house for dinner. What did we eat? How was the table set? What did my meal look like compared to yours?" Another long silence followed, and I could practically hear him reviewing recent memories, seeing them perhaps for the first time from my perspective. The silence on the phone stretched for what felt like an eternity. I could hear Michael breathing, could practically feel his mind racing as he processed what I had just revealed. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I can't believe I didn't see it. How long has this been going on?" "Since about 6 months after your wedding," I said quietly. "At first, I thought it was just awkwardness, maybe Brenda being nervous about hosting family dinners. But it became a pattern, and it got worse over time." "Why didn't you say something earlier?" The question hung between us, loaded with hurt and confusion. How could I explain that I had tried, in small ways, to address the situation? That I had offered to bring food, suggested we eat at my house, made gentle comments about the different treatment I was receiving. But every attempt had been deflected or ignored, and I had been made to feel like I was being difficult or ungrateful. "I kept hoping things would improve," I said finally. "And I didn't want to cause problems in your marriage. You seemed so happy, and I thought maybe I was being too sensitive." "Too sensitive?" Michael's voice rose with indignation. "Mom, if what you're telling me is true, this isn't about being sensitive. This is about basic respect and decency." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. For months, I had questioned my own perceptions, wondering if I was overreacting or misinterpreting Brenda's behavior. Having Michael validate my experience, even before he had fully processed it himself, meant more to me than I could express. "I need to talk to Brenda about this," he said, his voice tight with anger. "This is completely unacceptable." "Michael, wait," I said quickly. "Before you do anything, I want you to understand why I gave her the recipe collection." "I think I'm beginning to understand," he replied grimly. "I gave her those recipes because she's been treating me like I'm irrelevant to your life, like my contribution to your family doesn't matter. She's made it clear that she considers my cooking outdated and unnecessary. So I decided to give her the opportunity to prove she could do better." Michael was quiet again, and I could hear him putting the pieces together. "You knew she couldn't cook those recipes." "I suspected she would find them challenging," I admitted. "But Michael, these are your favorite foods, the meals that have been part of your life since childhood. If Brenda wants to be responsible for feeding you, if she wants to dismiss my role in your life, then she should be able to provide you with the foods that make you happy. This is about more than just recipes, isn't it? It's about love, Michael. It's about the daily act of caring for someone through food, of taking the time and effort to nourish them properly. Your grandmother taught me that cooking for someone is one of the most fundamental ways of showing love, and I've been trying to show you that love for 37 years. I paused, gathering courage for what I needed to say next. Brenda doesn't understand that. To her, food is just fuel, something to be ordered or purchased as efficiently as possible. She doesn't see the love that goes into planning a meal, selecting ingredients, spending hours in the kitchen to create something special. And because she doesn't understand it, she doesn't value it. And the paper plates, the leftover scraps, that's her way of showing me that I don't matter, that I'm not worth the same consideration she gives to other guests, or even to you. She's been systematically diminishing my place in your life, and you haven't noticed because it's been so gradual and so carefully done. Michael let out a long breath. I feel like such an idiot. How could I not have seen this? Because you love her, and you trust her to treat your family well. And because the changes happened slowly, over time. It's like the old saying about boiling a frog slowly so it doesn't notice the temperature change. What do you want me to do, Mom? How do we fix this? The question caught me off guard. I had been so focused on making Michael understand what had been happening that I hadn't fully considered what I wanted the outcome to be. Did I want an apology from Brenda? Did I want her to suddenly start cooking elaborate meals from my recipes? Did I want to return to the way things were before she came into our lives? I don't know if it can be fixed, Michael, I said honestly. This isn't just about misunderstandings or different approaches to hospitality. This is about fundamental values and respect for family. Brenda has shown me who she really is, how she really feels about me and my place in your life. But surely we can work this out. Maybe if I talked to her, explained how her behavior has affected you. Michael, she knows exactly what she's been doing. This wasn't accidental or thoughtless. She made deliberate choices about how to treat me, and those choices revealed her true character. The conversation continued for another hour, with Michael asking questions and me providing details about incidents he had never noticed or had dismissed as unimportant. I told him about the engagement party where Brenda's family had made dismissive comments about my casual cooking. I described the birthday dinner, where my homemade cake had been pushed aside for a store-bought alternative. I explained how the Sunday family dinners had gradually changed from warm, inclusive gatherings to formal events where I felt like an unwelcome obligation. As I spoke, I could hear Michael's growing anger and disbelief. He interrupted several times to ask for clarification or to express his shock at details he was hearing for the first time. It was clear that he was seeing his wife's behavior in a completely new light, and the picture that emerged was not flattering. I can't believe I've been so blind, he said finally, and I can't believe Brenda would treat you this way. It's not the woman I thought I married. People often show their true selves gradually, I replied. When we're dating or newly married, we're all on our best behavior. But over time, our real values and character traits emerge, especially in how we treat people who can't do anything for us. What do you mean? I mean that Brenda has nothing to gain from treating me well. I'm not important to her career, her social circle, or her daily life. The only reason to be kind to me would be out of love for you and respect for family relationships. Her behavior toward me reveals what she really values and how she treats people when there's no benefit to herself. That evening, I received a call from Brenda. Her voice was strained and defensive, and she wasted no time getting to the point. Evelyn, Michael told me about your conversation today. I think there's been a serious misunderstanding about the dinners and how I've been treating you. What kind of misunderstanding? I asked, keeping my tone neutral. I never intended to make you feel unwelcome or disrespected. If you interpreted my actions that way, I'm sorry, but I think you may have misread the situation. I was struck by the careful wording of her apology. She was sorry that I had interpreted her actions negatively, not sorry for the actions themselves. She was suggesting that the problem was my perception, not her behavior. Brenda, can you explain why I've been eating from paper plates while you and Michael use china? Well, I thought you preferred the casual approach. You always seemed more comfortable with informal meals, and I was trying to accommodate your preferences. And the different food? Why have you been serving me leftovers while you and Michael eat fresh, expensive meals? I was trying to be considerate of your dietary needs. At your age, I thought you might prefer lighter, simpler foods. I was looking out for your health. Every excuse she offered made me angrier. She was rewriting history, trying to make her dismissive treatment sound like thoughtful consideration. Worse, she was using my age as justification for treating me as less deserving of good food and proper place settings. Brenda, I'm 73 years old, not 93. I have no dietary restrictions, and I've never expressed a preference for simple foods or casual table settings. You made assumptions about what I needed based on your own convenience and your desire to minimize the effort you put into hosting me. I think you're being unfair, Evelyn. I've always tried to include you in our family gatherings, and I've gone out of my way to accommodate what I thought were your preferences. If you genuinely believed that paper plates and leftover scraps were what I preferred, why didn't you ask me? Why didn't you notice that I wasn't eating much or that I seemed uncomfortable? There was a long pause before she answered. I guess I assumed you would speak up if you were unhappy with something. I did speak up, Brenda, multiple times. I offered to bring food to contribute to the meals. I suggested we have dinner at my house occasionally. I made comments about the beautiful china you used for special occasions. You dismissed every attempt I made to address the situation. I never meant for you to feel dismissed, but I did feel dismissed. And now that Michael has pointed out the discrepancies in how you've been treating me, you're trying to reframe your behavior as consideration, rather than taking responsibility for the hurt you've caused. The conversation continued in this circular pattern for several more minutes, with Brenda offering explanations that didn't hold up to scrutiny, and me pointing out the inconsistencies in her reasoning. It became clear that she had no intention of taking genuine responsibility for her actions, or making meaningful changes to how she treated me. Finally, she played what I suspect she thought was her trump card. Evelyn, I think we both want what's best for Michael. He's been very upset since your conversation today, and I hate to see him caught in the middle of this conflict between us. Maybe we could agree to put this behind us and move forward in a more positive way. What does moving forward look like to you, Brenda? Well, I could try to be more mindful about the meals when you visit. And maybe you could give me some guidance about cooking a few of those family recipes. Help me learn to make some of Michael's favorite dishes. I felt a surge of frustration. Even now, when confronted with the consequences of her behavior, Brenda was trying to find a way to make me solve the problems she had created. She wanted me to teach her to cook so she could take credit for providing Michael with his favorite foods, while also expecting me to excuse months of disrespectful treatment. Brenda, the recipes are yours to use as you see fit. I'm not going to provide cooking lessons or guidance. If you want to learn to prepare those dishes, you'll need to figure it out on your own, just like every other cook in the world has done. But some of those recipes are really complicated. It would be so much easier if you could just show me a few techniques. Learning to cook takes time and practice. It requires patience, attention to detail, and a genuine desire to nourish the people you care about. Those aren't things I can teach you in a few lessons. After the call ended, I sat in my quiet kitchen, surrounded by the familiar tools and ingredients that had been my companions for so many years. I felt emotionally drained, but also strangely liberated. For the first time in months, I had spoken honestly about what I had been experiencing, and I had refused to make excuses for someone else's poor behavior. The next few days passed quietly. Michael called twice, both times to apologize for not noticing how Brenda had been treating me, and to express his determination to address the situation. He seemed genuinely shocked by what he had learned, and I could hear the strain in his voice as he struggled to reconcile the woman he had married with the behavior I had described. I've been thinking about everything you told me, he said during our second conversation, and I keep remembering little things that I dismissed at the time but that make sense now. The way Brenda would talk about your cooking being too rich or old-fashioned. The way she'd steer conversations away when you tried to share family stories. The way she'd always have reasons why we couldn't eat at your house. It's hard to see patterns when you're in the middle of them, I replied. And you had no reason to suspect that Brenda would deliberately treat me badly. But I should have been paying attention. You're my mother, and it's my responsibility to make sure you're treated with respect in my home. What are you going to do, Michael? I don't know yet. Brenda and I have been having some difficult conversations. She keeps insisting that you misunderstood her intentions. But when I press her for details about specific incidents, her explanations don't make sense. What kind of explanations? Like when I asked her about the Thanksgiving dinner where you got turkey scraps while we had carved turkey, she said she was saving the best parts for us, because we were hosting, and it was our first Thanksgiving as a married couple. But that doesn't explain why she didn't give you a proper plate or any of the side dishes we were eating. I wasn't surprised that Brenda was still trying to justify her behavior, rather than acknowledging the hurt she had caused. It confirmed what I had suspected about her character and her priorities. She also keeps bringing up the recipe collection, Michael continued. She's saying that giving her those complicated recipes was unfair and that you set her up to fail. She wants me to ask you to take them back. What do you think about that? I think she's missing the point. Those recipes represent our family history and traditions. Even if she never cooks a single one of them, she should understand their value and be honored that you trusted her with them. And if she doesn't want to learn to cook them? Then I guess I'll have to accept that the foods I grew up eating will become just memories. But Mom, I'm not going to let her give those recipes back to you. They belong in my home now, even if they just sit in that beautiful box and remind me of where I came from. A week later, Michael called with news that didn't surprise me but still felt like a punch to the stomach. Mom, Brenda and I have been to counseling twice this week, and it's not going well. She doesn't seem to understand why I'm so upset about how she treated you, and she keeps saying that you're being oversensitive and that families have different styles of hospitality. What does the counselor think? The counselor asked Brenda to explain her reasoning for serving you different food and using paper plates, and Brenda gave the same explanations she's been giving us. When the counselor pointed out that she could have asked about your preferences instead of making assumptions, Brenda got defensive and said that older people are often set in their ways and don't adapt well to change. I felt my heart sink. Brenda was not only refusing to acknowledge her behavior as problematic, she was doubling down on her ageist assumptions and treating me like a burden that had to be managed, rather than a family member who deserved respect. The counselor also asked why Brenda hadn't noticed that you seemed uncomfortable or weren't eating much during these dinners, and Brenda said she assumed you were just being polite and that older people don't eat as much anyway. And what did you say to that? I told her that you've always had a healthy appetite and that you've never been shy about expressing your opinions or preferences. I said that her assumptions about your age and eating habits were insulting and wrong. How did she respond? She started crying and said that she felt like I was taking your side against her, that she was being attacked for trying to be a good hostess in her own home. She said she never intended to hurt anyone, and that it wasn't fair for us to judge her so harshly for honest mistakes. I recognized this pattern from our own phone conversation. When confronted with the consequences of her actions, Brenda retreated into victimhood, portraying herself as misunderstood rather than acknowledging the harm she had caused. Michael, what do you think about her response? I think she's more concerned about being seen as the victim than she is about making things right with you. And I think that tells me everything I need to know about her character. 3 weeks later, Michael appeared at my door on a Saturday morning, looking haggard and older than his 37 years. He was carrying the wooden recipe box, and my heart immediately jumped to the wrong conclusion. She made you bring them back, I said, feeling defeated. No, Mom. I brought them myself. Brenda and I are getting separated. I stared at him, trying to process this information. While I had hoped that Michael would finally see Brenda clearly, I hadn't expected their marriage to end over this situation. Are you sure that's what you want? I asked, stepping aside to let him into the house. I'm sure, he said, settling into his familiar spot at my kitchen table. This isn't just about how she treated you, although that was certainly the catalyst. Once I started paying attention, I realized that Brenda has been showing me her true character in a lot of ways I had been ignoring. What do you mean? I mean, the way she talks about service workers, like waiters and store clerks. The way she treats people she considers beneath her, socially or financially. The way she dismisses anyone who doesn't share her interests or lifestyle preferences. I had been chalking it up to her being particular or having high standards, but now I see it as arrogance and lack of empathy. Michael opened the recipe box and began pulling out cards, handling them with obvious reverence. I want to learn to cook some of these myself, Mom. I want to stay connected to our family traditions, and I want to be able to make the foods that remind me of home. Some of them are quite challenging, I warned, remembering Brenda's disastrous pot roast attempt. I know, but I have something Brenda didn't have. I have you to teach me, and I have genuine motivation to learn. These recipes aren't a burden to me or a test of my abilities. They're a connection to the people I love and the memories that shaped me. Over the following months, Michael and I developed a new tradition. Every Sunday, he would come to my house, and we would cook together. I started him with simple recipes, like the meatloaf and chicken casserole, and gradually introduced more complex techniques as his confidence and skills improved. It was during one of these cooking sessions that Michael told me about Brenda's final attempt to salvage their relationship. She offered to take cooking classes, he said, carefully browning onions for the beef stew we were making. She said she would learn to make all your recipes and that she would apologize to you properly for the misunderstandings. What did you tell her? I told her it was too late for that. The problem wasn't that she couldn't cook. The problem was that she had no respect for you, for our family traditions, or for the love and effort that goes into caring for people through food. He paused in his stirring to look at me directly. I also told her that if she had genuinely cared about making me happy, she would have asked you to teach her these recipes from the beginning, instead of dismissing them as outdated and unnecessary. And how did she respond to that? She said that you had never offered to teach her, that you had been unwelcoming from the start, and that she felt like you didn't approve of her. I considered this accusation carefully. Had I been unwelcoming to Brenda? I didn't think so, but I tried to examine my early interactions with her honestly. Michael, do you remember the first time I cooked for Brenda? I made that elaborate Sunday dinner with honey-glazed ham and all the traditional sides. I remember. You spent 2 days preparing that meal. And do you remember how she responded? She said everything was very rich and asked if you had anything lighter. I offered several times to teach her family recipes, to take her grocery shopping, to include her in holiday meal preparations. She declined every invitation, saying she preferred modern approaches to cooking and meal planning. I remember that too. I thought she was just being independent, showing that she didn't need help from anyone. The truth is, Michael, I would have welcomed Brenda into our family traditions if she had shown any genuine interest. I would have loved to pass on these recipes to someone who would appreciate them and continue the traditions, but she made it clear from the beginning that she considered my approach to cooking outdated and irrelevant. We worked in comfortable silence for a while, the familiar rhythm of chopping vegetables and stirring sauces creating a peaceful atmosphere in my kitchen. Finally, Michael spoke again. You know what the saddest part is? Brenda never understood what she was rejecting. She saw your cooking as work, as an inconvenience, as something that took too much time and effort. She never understood that it was love made tangible, that every meal you prepared was a way of showing care and creating connection. That's the difference between feeding someone and nourishing them, I replied. Feeding is about providing calories and nutrients. Nourishing is about providing comfort, love, and a sense of belonging. Brenda was very good at feeding, but she never learned how to nourish. 6 months after Michael's separation from Brenda, I received an unexpected phone call. It was Patricia, Brenda's mother, and she sounded upset. Evelyn, I hope you don't mind me calling you directly. I got your number from Brenda, and I wanted to speak with you about everything that's happened. I was surprised by the call, but curious to hear what she had to say. Of course, Patricia. How can I help you? I wanted to apologize for my daughter's behavior toward you. Brenda told me about the recipe collection and the problems with family dinners, and I have to say, I'm ashamed of how she treated you. This was not what I had expected. During the brief interactions I'd had with Patricia at family gatherings, she had seemed supportive of Brenda's modern lifestyle and dismissive of traditional approaches to homemaking. I appreciate you saying that. I replied carefully. The thing is, Evelyn, I raised Brenda to be independent and career-focused, and I think I may have failed to teach her about the importance of family relationships and traditions. When she told me about those recipes and how overwhelmed she felt by your expectations, my first instinct was to support her. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that you were offering her something precious, and she threw it away. Patricia's voice became emotional as she continued. My own mother tried to teach me to cook when I was young, but I was too busy with my career to pay attention. I thought cooking was old-fashioned, something that would hold me back professionally. Now I'm 68 years old, and I can barely make a decent meal for myself. I never learned the recipes that connected me to my heritage, and I never passed that knowledge on to Brenda. It's never too late to learn, I said gently. Maybe not, but I think it's too late for Brenda. She's so convinced that she was wronged in this situation, so certain that you and Michael were unfair to her, that she can't see her own role in destroying her marriage. What do you mean? She's been staying with me since the separation, and she spends most of her time complaining about how unreasonable you both were. She says you set impossible standards, and that Michael chose his mother over his wife. She doesn't seem to understand that the problem wasn't your expectations, but her unwillingness to show basic respect and consideration. Patricia paused, and I could hear her struggling with her emotions. I keep thinking about those recipes you gave her, about the time and love you put into writing them down and sharing your family history. Brenda saw them as a burden, but I see them as one of the most generous gifts one woman could give to another. I meant them as a gift, I confirmed. I wanted Brenda to understand the importance of those dishes in Michael's life, and to give her the tools she needed to continue those traditions. She still has the recipe box, you know. She brought it with her when she moved in with me, and it's sitting on my kitchen counter. Sometimes I take out the cards and read them, and I'm amazed by the detail and care you put into every one. What does Brenda plan to do with them? I don't think she knows. Part of her wants to throw them away out of spite, but another part of her seems to understand that they're valuable, even if she doesn't want to admit it. The conversation with Patricia stayed with me for days. It reinforced my understanding that the conflict with Brenda hadn't really been about cooking or recipes at all. It had been about values, respect, and the different ways people express love and care for their families. A year later, Michael surprised me with news that I hadn't expected. He had started dating someone new, a woman named Sarah, who worked as a family elementary school teacher and shared his interest in family traditions and home cooking. I want you to meet her, Mom, but I also want to be honest about why this relationship feels different from my marriage to Brenda. What do you mean? I mean that Sarah actually wants to learn about our family recipes. When I told her about the recipe collection and the traditions we've been rebuilding together, she asked if she could join us for some of our Sunday cooking sessions. I felt a flutter of hope mixed with caution. I didn't want to be disappointed again if this new relationship didn't work out, but I was intrigued by the possibility of sharing my knowledge with someone who genuinely wanted to learn. What's she like? I asked. She's warm and genuine and curious about everything. She grew up in a family that cooked together, so she understands the connection between food and love. And Mom, when I told her about the way Brenda treated you, she was horrified. She said that anyone who would disrespect their partner's mother that way was revealing their true character. When I finally met Sarah, I was immediately struck by her genuine warmth and interest in our family traditions. She arrived at our Sunday cooking session with a notebook and pen, ready to take notes and ask questions. Unlike Brenda, who had seen cooking as a chore to be avoided, Sarah approached it as an opportunity to learn and connect. Mrs. Thompson, she said as I showed her how to properly knead bread dough, Michael has told me so much about your cooking and your family recipes. I feel incredibly honored that you're willing to share this knowledge with me. Please call me Evelyn, I replied, watching her carefully follow my instructions for achieving the right texture in the dough. And I'm happy to share these recipes with anyone who appreciates their importance. Michael showed me some of the recipe cards you wrote for Brenda, and I was amazed by the detail and love you put into every one. The stories about family gatherings and special occasions, the explanations of techniques and timing, the notes about Michael's preferences and memories. It's like a cookbook and a family history combined. As we worked together that afternoon, I found myself cautiously optimistic about Sarah's place in our family. She asked thoughtful questions about the recipes, listened carefully to the stories behind each dish, and showed genuine enthusiasm for learning the traditions that had been passed down through generations of women in my family. More importantly, she treated me with the respect and consideration that had been missing from my relationship with Brenda. She insisted on helping with cleanup, asked about my preferences for ingredients and techniques, and made it clear that she valued my knowledge and experience. 6 months later, when Michael told me he was planning to propose to Sarah, I felt nothing but happiness for both of them. Sarah had proven herself to be everything Brenda was not: respectful, caring, genuinely interested in family traditions, and committed to nourishing the people she loved. "I want to ask you something, Mom," Michael said during one of our Sunday cooking sessions. "Sarah and I have been talking about the wedding, and we want to incorporate some family traditions into the reception. Would you be willing to help us plan a menu using some of our family recipes?" I felt tears spring to my eyes. After everything that had happened with Brenda, the idea of sharing our family recipes for such a joyous occasion felt like the perfect redemption. "I would be honored," I replied. "What did you have in mind?" "We want comfort foods, dishes that tell the story of our family and make people feel welcomed and loved. Sarah suggested we start with your famous fried chicken and build the menu from there." Over the next few months, Sarah and I worked together to plan a wedding reception menu that celebrated our family traditions while accommodating modern dietary preferences and logistical requirements. We decided on a buffet featuring my grandmother's fried chicken, slow-cooked barbecue using my secret spice rub, creamy mac and cheese made with 3 different cheeses, green beans cooked with bacon and onions, cornbread made from my great-grandmother's recipe, and a variety of desserts including my famous German chocolate cake. Sarah insisted on helping with all the preparation, spending weekends in my kitchen learning the techniques that would ensure each dish turned out perfectly. Unlike Brenda, who had been overwhelmed by the complexity of family recipes, Sarah embraced the challenge and found joy in mastering each new skill. "I love that every recipe has a story," she said as we practiced making the coconut pecan frosting for the German chocolate cake. "It's not just about following directions, it's about connecting with the women who came before us and carrying on their legacy." The wedding reception was everything I had hoped it would be. The food was delicious, the guests were delighted by the homemade dishes, and Sarah glowed with pride as people complimented the meal and asked for recipes. Watching her serve food that she had helped prepare, seeing her explain the family history behind each dish, I felt like our traditions were finally in safe hands. During the reception, I was approached by several of Sarah's family members, who wanted to compliment the food and learn more about the recipes. Sarah's mother, in particular, was eager to share cooking stories and family traditions of her own. "Evelyn, this meal is incredible," she said, balancing a plate loaded with fried chicken and all the sides. "Sarah has told me so much about the cooking lessons you've been giving her, and I can see why she's so excited about joining your family." "She's a natural cook," I replied, watching Sarah chat with guests and accept compliments on the meal with gracious humility. "She has the most important ingredient, the desire to nourish the people she loves. That's exactly what cooking should be about," Sarah's mother agreed. "I've been trying to teach my daughters that food is love, but sometimes I think the younger generation doesn't understand the connection." "Sarah understands it perfectly," I assured her. "She's going to carry on these traditions and probably improve on them." As the evening wound cooled down and Michael and Sarah prepared to leave for their honeymoon, Sarah pulled me aside for a private conversation. "Evelyn, I want you to know how much these past months have meant to me. Learning your family recipes, hearing the stories behind them, being welcomed into your traditions. It's been one of the most meaningful experiences of my life." "You've given new life to those recipes, Sarah. They were in danger of being lost, and you've ensured they'll continue for another generation." "I have something for you," she said, reaching into her purse and pulling out a small, leather-bound notebook. "I've been writing down all the variations and improvements we've discovered together, along with notes about Michael's preferences and memories of cooking with you." I thought you might like to have a record of this new chapter in our family's culinary history. I opened the notebook and found page after page of Sarah's neat handwriting, documenting our cooking sessions with the same care and attention to detail that I had put into the original recipe collection. She had noted which techniques worked best for different weather conditions, how to adjust recipes for larger quantities, and dozens of small discoveries we had made together. This is beautiful, Sarah, thank you. I also want you to know that I plan to keep cooking with you as long as you're willing to teach me. These traditions don't end with the wedding. They're part of our ongoing family life, and I want to make sure they stay alive and vibrant. 2 years later, as I write this story, Sarah and Michael have settled into a rhythm of Sunday cooking sessions that brings me more joy than I could have imagined. We've expanded beyond the traditional family recipes to experiment with new dishes and techniques, always with an eye toward creating meals that nourish both body and soul. Sarah has become the daughter I never had, someone who shares my passion for cooking and understands the connection between food and love. She calls me throughout the week with questions about ingredients or techniques, sends me photos of dishes she's attempting on her own, and never fails to credit me when friends ask for recipes. More importantly, she has given Michael back the connection to his heritage that Brenda had tried to sever. He now knows how to make most of his favorite childhood dishes, and he takes pride in carrying on traditions that connect him to previous generations of our family. The recipe box that I gave to Brenda has found its proper home in Michael and Sarah's kitchen, where it sits on the counter like a treasured heirloom. The cards show signs of use now, with flour fingerprints and sauce stains that tell the story of meals lovingly prepared and shared. I never heard from Brenda again after her conversation with Patricia, and I don't expect to. According to Michael, she moved back to Atlanta and married a wealthy businessman who appreciates her modern lifestyle and has no interest in family traditions or home cooking. I wish her well, but I'm grateful that she's no longer part of our lives. Sometimes I think about what might have happened if Brenda had responded differently to my gift of recipes. If she had seen them as an opportunity to connect with Michael's heritage, rather than as a burden or a test. If she had approached cooking with curiosity and love, rather than resentment and fear. If she had treated me with respect and consideration, instead of dismissing me as irrelevant to their modern life. But I've learned that you can't force someone to value what they don't naturally appreciate. Brenda saw cooking as work, tradition as limitation, and family recipes as outdated obligations. Sarah sees cooking as love, tradition as connection, and family recipes as precious gifts to be treasured and shared. The difference between them isn't about cooking skill or natural talent. It's about understanding that food is one of the most fundamental ways we care for each other, that taking time to nourish someone properly is an act of love that transcends mere sustenance. My grandmother Mabel Ruth used to say that you could tell everything you needed to know about a person by watching how they treated a family recipe. Would they follow it with care and respect? Would they take the time to understand why each step mattered? Would they see the love that went into its creation and preservation? Brenda failed that test, not because she couldn't cook, but because she couldn't love in the way that cooking requires. Sarah passed it with flying colors, not because she was already a skilled cook, but because she understood that every recipe was a love letter from one generation to the next. Today, when I watch Sarah teach my future grandchildren to crack eggs and measure flour, I know that my grandmother's legacy lives on. The recipes that Brenda saw as scraps have become treasures, and the traditions she dismissed as outdated continue to nourish our family with love, one meal at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.